Hi folks, on July 28, just a few days from now, Venezuelans will return to the polls, as they have done so many times since the Chavista dictatorship began a quarter of a century ago. The first few times Chavismo won because, like all populist authoritarian governments with abundant commodities and a powerful narrative in their early stages, the Chavistas controlled the levers of power and the regime was popular. Later, it won again and again by employing three illicit weapons: disqualifying competitive rivals, committing blatant electoral fraud, and using force systematically, brutally against opponents and those who protested. Why should it be any different this time? The leader of the opposition and of the democratic resistance movement, let's call it that, Maria Corina Machado, has not been able to even register as a candidate because the dictatorship disqualified her, and in her place, the unitary platform that serves as an umbrella for the opposition forces is united with her support behind the 74-year-old diplomat Edmundo González. In a race against the clock, González, aided by Maria Corina, who has become a veritable mass phenomenon in Venezuela and is urging her compatriots to back him, has toured the country making himself known to people who had barely even heard of him a few weeks ago. Today he has a very wide lead over Nicolás Maduro in the polls though. But the dictatorship has violated several of the agreements it reached with the opposition under international supervision in Barbados last year to ensure free and fair elections, and all indications are that it will again commit fraud on July 28. However, there is something that makes these elections different from all previous ones. Never has Chavismo been weaker than today, more repudiated by the population, and never has the opposition mustered so much popular legitimacy at all levels of society. Its leader, as I say, has become a phenomenon that goes beyond politics. The hope, the expectations, and the fervent adhesion that she has awakened in a population that until recently was downtrodden and defeated foretell an overwhelming vote in favor of the opposition candidate she is backing. The opposition has set up a much more sophisticated and extensive voting surveillance apparatus than in the past, and the worldwide attention that these elections have attracted is greater than on previous occasions. All this makes it possible to assume that it'll be much more difficult for the regime to commit the kind of electoral fraud it is used to committing, and that the response of the Venezuelan people and the international community will be much more forceful than before. Does this mean that, unlike previous occasions, there is a real possibility that under irresistible internal and external pressure, a faction of the Chavista regime will break with Maduro and accept the invitation that Maria Corina has extended to the military and the civilians of the dictatorship to negotiate a democratic transition, one that will guarantee Chavismo a political existence in a future liberal democracy far away from revenge and the settling of scores? In other words, is a way out possible this time, as in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia or Chile at the end of the 80s, or Spain and Portugal in the 1970s? When I was a child, people at home talked about relatives who had gone to live in Venezuela and who came back once a year with stories about the wealth of that country that our fantasy elevated to the status of myth. And for the most part it was true. Although Venezuela had already begun its decline, there was still much of the prosperity that in previous decades had turned Venezuela into the leading economy in Latin America and the country among all developing nations whose per capita income was closest to that of the United States. Not only that, in a subcontinent marked by institutional instability, coups, revolutions, and military dictatorships, Venezuela had a stable liberal democracy. Except for a brief period of a few years in the 1950s, Venezuela had managed to consolidate its liberal democracy thanks to agreements and a broad consensus among its main political actors and organizations, marking a stark contrast with the rest of the region. All that went to hell decades later. This is not the place to analyze why. I have always been fascinated by countries that in a short time managed to abandon underdevelopment and embrace prosperity, to move from political barbarism to civilization, but also by those countries like Argentina and Venezuela, or in other parts of the globe, to a certain extent Lebanon or Turkey, where I am now, that make the opposite journey. The reasons vary, the historical moments too, but the fact is that there are countries like Venezuela that one day begin to commit suicide. Some of them later resurrect, others don't. They die indefinitely and perhaps forever, But even in the first case, several generations suffer. For them, past prosperity and civilization become something like a remote national myth, unreachable and unthinkable in the here and now. More than 8 million people have fled Venezuela because of Chavismo. The cruel Chavista dictatorship, by the way, has of course denied them the right to vote on July 28. And it is highly likely, if the opposition, with international help, does not manage to protect its certain victory at the polls in a few days and trigger a real transition, that many millions more will do the same in the months and years to come. Let us all, to the best of our abilities, wherever we may be, do what we can to focus the world's attention on the fight of Venezuela's heroes. There is, in the calendar of freedom, no date more important than this one.